Welcome to the Neurofaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Curt Thompson, and we are here to explore what it means to live at the intersection of emerging scientific discoveries about the mind and following and being formed by Jesus, and how that can lead us into a world of greater human flourishing. We are eager to hear from our guests not only about the work they are doing, but how it speaks to what it means for us to thrive in our present particular moment. My guest on today's episode is Dr. Peter Hill. Dr. Hill is professor of psychology at Biola University's Rosemead Graduate School of Psychology. Prior to this, he served for 17 years as professor of psychology at Grove City College. In 2006, he was honored with a faculty appointment at the University of Cambridge as a visiting research fellow at the Center for Advanced Religious and Theological Studies of the Faculty of Divinity. Dr. Hill is an active researcher in social psychology and the psychology of religion, where he has authored approximately 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters. He has also authored or co-authored at least 6 books, and his research interests include religious and spiritual measurement, religious fundamentalism, the development of positive virtues, the affective basis of religion, and workplace spirituality. Dr. Hill, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be welcomed. So I look forward to our time together.
I would love to hear from you a little bit about your own personal story and how that emerged to help shape you and draw you into the work that you're doing. We'd love to hear some about that.
Sure. I'm happy to share some of my story. I grew up in a religious home and knew much about faith-related issues through my family. I was regular at church, even on a Wednesday night during Little League season. I could play my baseball game, but then the church was right across the street, and I would get over there as soon as the game was done, even with my uniform still on. So I was quite embedded into a religious culture. At age 9, we had a significant event in our family. I had an older brother who was killed in a car accident. And that was obviously very formative. I was the only child in that family, and really wanted to be. I had that sense all the way along. You know, I'm now everything that my parents have, and I wanted to be a good kid. But of course, during the adolescent years, a lot of struggles and so forth. Eventually, even though my father wanted me to be a lawyer, he really was hoping for that. I opted for psychology. One of my favorite stories is that long after graduating with my PhD, he wanted to read my dissertation. I told him, "Dad, you'll never understand it. It's boring," and so forth. I happened to be visiting him the very night that he was finishing my dissertation, and he said,
"Oh my goodness!"
He said, closed it up, and he said, "Didn't understand a word of it, but it was the best book I ever read." And so that took care of the lawyer business, and it was sort of justified my work as a social psychologist, and that's what I am. I'm a social psychologist, even though I work in primarily a clinical psych program. And social psychology is, how do people think about each other? How do they relate to each other? How do they influence and are influenced by other people? And that really got me into this whole field of religion and spirituality, given my own background. But now it was a very nicely applied area of social psychology. And so I just sort of gravitated to it. And since my days at Grove City College that you mentioned back in the 1980s, that's where I've devoted most of my research. And as you mentioned, one of those areas is in the area of workplace spirituality.
Well, you know, I have to say, if we were to just randomly pick 10, let alone 100 people off the street and ask them, so tell me, what's your experience of and understanding of workplace spirituality? I can only imagine that most of those folks might look at us like we have two heads. I would love for you to talk about what your sense is? Explain to our audience, introduce our audience to this. I think many of them might be intrigued. I'm certainly intrigued. I love this notion. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Notice we're using the term workplace spirituality, not workplace religion, and the meaning of the two terms I really think should have some overlap, but they are increasingly becoming polarized as
Mm,
different terms. Religion, more that reified, objectified view that's institutional, that's belief based or doctrinal, that it's very objective in the minds of many people. This is the view. I'm not necessarily saying all
hmm
of this is correct, but this is
hmm
the view that many hold. Whereas spirituality is more that individual notion, experiential more than cognitive or doctrinal. That it's very personal and subjective, and what it might mean to one person doesn't necessarily mean that it's to another. But I think
hmm
both are involved in what we might call a search for the sacred.
mm,
And the sacred, I guess also has to be defined as well. And I understand the sacred as being persons or objects or maybe even events that are deemed worthy of ultimate truth and devotion. And the difference, I think, between religion and spirituality is that religion tends to rather explicitly define what is worthy of ultimate truth and devotion. Whereas this more contemporary use of the term spirituality, it's a little more loose. It might say, well, we're not, it doesn't need to be explicitly defined. That the person should be allowed to define that for himself or
hmm
herself.
Just for a question of clarification, and we're going to get to this notion of workplace spirituality in just a moment. But my curiosity is piqued as you are describing this notion that spirituality's defining boundaries can feel kind of porous, not necessarily, they're not just always neat and clean about where we are, when am I now being spiritual and when am I not being spiritual. And I'm wondering what that's like for you as a researcher who necessarily depends upon having some sort of boundaries in order for you to kind of define what it is that you're studying. Would love to hear you talk about what it's been like for you to kind of discern how you create and understand where those boundaries are that you're then going to that you're then trying to study.
Well, one thing that we try to do usually in our research, and most of our research is of an empirical variety. It's not just theoretical or
hmm
conceptual.
hmm
Sometimes that involves what we call qualitative research, where you're interviewing people and trying to glean from them their understanding of what it means to be spiritual, and let them tell you. And then usually we have to code this, somehow. Or we also have more of a quantifiable approach, which is where we have various measures. In fact, there's literally hundreds of measures that we now have, not just on defining spirituality, but in the whole area of the psychology of religion and spirituality. And some of it gets precisely at this:
hmm
how explicit, how tangible, how certain is a person of what they believe versus
hmm
more of almost anything goes. And
hmm
so sometimes we're looking for certain types of people, and sometimes we want to get all types of people, and then see that variability in their understanding of the term,
hmm
and
hmm
then correlate it maybe with some other things, such as their own well being or their sense of spiritual intelligence, and
hmm
so forth. So that's how we tend to go about doing this. We're studying people and
hmm
how they then perceive and grasp things. So that's what we try to get at.
So tell us then, how do you make that connection between spirituality and this thing that we call the workplace?
Sure, sure. First of all, I think often in a very broad sense of the word, spirituality, many researchers refer to it as just simply what provides meaning, what provides
Hmm.
a sense of meaning. So when people come to questions like what makes life worth living or what are my deepest held values, often they tend to define those in terms of their work. I know
Mm-hmm.
I do as a professor. I get my strong sense of why life is worth living and what my uh, very deeply held values are through my teaching and through my research work that I'm doing. So I have a colleague who had a very lucrative position at one time as a computer programmer designing T-shirts, and he decided, this was before he got his graduate degree and so forth, he decided to quit that job, go to graduate school, spend several years in graduate school for a lesser paid position eventually as a colleague of mine. And when I asked him, I said, "Well, why did you do this?" When he was interviewing for this position, he says, "I did not want to spend the rest of my life making T-shirts." It
Uh,
was as
uh,
simple as that.
mm,
It just was simply not a spiritual striving that was going to be
hmm.
fulfilled in
Hmm.
that kind of workplace. So, and there's such interesting examples. Tony Dungy, he's a former NFL football coach,
Hmm.
and at the professional level, he has a Super Bowl ring. And you know what he's coaching now? He's on TV doing a lot of sportscasting and so forth, but he's coaching eighth grade football as well.
Mm,
And
mm,
he said, the reason why I'm doing this is that I don't see it as a demotion. I see this as an opportunity to have an influence on young men's
mhm,
lives.
mhm, mhm.
So there are these kinds of things that people carry with them into their sense of work. Now, I think some people, they have very strong spiritual interests, and just like when we talk about a person and organization fit in the workplace, we
Mhm.
usually think of it in terms, well, are they interested in what our organization does? Do they have the right skills for it? But I would argue also that there is such a thing as a spiritual person
Mm,
organization fit.
mm,
Now, some people, to me, at least my understanding of a lot of this is some people are very integrative with their spirituality. They see it woven into all parts of who they are, including their work as an employee. So they
mhm,
bring their spirituality with them, and it's woven into the very fabric of their job. So for them, they're probably looking for an organization that will facilitate their need for
mm.
spiritual development.
So
Uh,
they would naturally, perhaps they would be gravitating toward an organization that is going to necessarily have the space within it that would engender their capacity to live out their spiritual values in that very space. Am I hearing that right?
That is correct. Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, and I like how you identified, is there a space that's available? Because admittedly, in some professions, assembly line work, it might be pretty difficult to identify
Mhm.
what space is available to help meet spiritual strivings and needs. That doesn't mean that companies can't do that, but it's going to be more difficult to.
So, so I want to ask a question about that. I would imagine. So, I have a brother-in-law who is in the industry of making pallets. Which, if we don't, if you know, if our listeners don't know it, the world runs on pallets. And there's recently been, as it turns out, a pallet shortage. And where there is a shortage of pallets, there's a shortage of stuff to be transported because you can't transport it without them. And my brother-in-law is a deeply thoughtful follower of Jesus, and thinks about these things, about this, like, how do we create meaning and value in a workspace where what we're doing is building pallets. And if he were to call you up and invite you to come in and talk to their staff, talk to their leaders, what would you want them to be aware of? Recognizing that there are tiers of different kinds of jobs that are taking place, everything from the leaders who are running this organization all the way down to the frontline workers that are building these pallets and making them available for everything else that we're doing, what would be some things that you would want them to know that are really important about how spirituality is going to be affecting people in their workplace?
Well, I don't know a lot about building pallets, but what I do know is that they are crucial when it comes to commerce. And
Yeah.
right now, there's such a, we've got this supply side problem in our society, and it's just a beautiful invitation to see how important pallets are.
Mm.
You've
Mm-hmm.
got to have them in order to move a lot of those goods.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's other reasons why we're not able to move goods, but maybe pallets is one of them. And if there's a shortage of personnel to make pallets, then it has its downside there as well. But I think that if you can see beyond just what you yourself are doing,
Mm.
where does this fit into a much larger picture
Mm-hmm.
of in this case of how society runs our
Mm-hmm.
entire economic system depends upon pallets to some
Mm-hmm.
extent. So I think just seeing that just last night I saw a very interesting show on a household name here in Southern California, but for people who are not out here, they might not be aware of In and Out hamburgers.
Oh, I'm very familiar with them. Yeah.
Great
Yeah.
hamburgers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's absolutely. If you ever are in an In and Out, just watch the people work. And I've always wondered, why is it they are enthusiastic? They work hard. I've never seen one not really hustle around back
Mm-hmm.
in the kitchen and
Mm-hmm.
there. And they leave it very transparent. They keep it open across the counter.
Mm-hmm.
So on
Mm-hmm.
this television show, they were arguing, what is In and Out's secret? Because so many other hamburger chains have trouble keeping their employees.
Mm-hmm.
And when they do keep them, they're not very motivated. Well, it has to do with the entire system that In and Out teaches. They've actually got their own television network for employees only to say why this is meaningful work. Flipping
Wow.
burgers is meaningful,
Wow.
and look at the connections with people that you make, and
Mm.
how people go away fulfilled, and so forth. So I think some companies are good at that, and I think
Mm.
some companies miss the boat entirely.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like, you're really talking about inviting people to be curious and mindful and aware of of a dimension of the workplace that many people, when they think about, oh, I'm going to go here to work to get a job, they're not necessarily thinking about that. And I'm hearing you say that this workplace, the mindfulness of the spiritual formation that's taking place in that workplace is a vital thing to be drawing people's attention to if they're going to work there.
That's true, at least for some people. Some people, it might
Huh?
even be a turnoff. Like
Mm-hmm.
sounds a little flaky for me, and I'm really not interested. And yet, even those people, there is research that shows that even those people, though, appreciate an attempt by an organization to be able to facilitate spirituality, even if they do not view themselves as being spiritual people.
Yeah.
So there is real value, I think, to it in the form of worker satisfaction, in the form of lower turnover rates. This whole notion that there's what's often communicated by organizations that tend to facilitate spirituality is that they themselves express a lot of spiritual values such as openness, connection, the idea of personal development and growth, work related meaning, purpose, servant leadership that's often
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
involved in it. And people appreciate that, even if they themselves would say, no, I'm not a particularly spiritual person.
Yeah. As you're talking, I'm aware that we live in an age in which, in many respects, people will pay attention to certain kinds of data. If a theologian were to walk into a workplace and say, "Hey, y'all, it's really important to pay attention to your spirituality here," we might look at him and say, "Thank you, see ya." Um, But as a psychologist, there is a certain mantle of responsibility that is given because of the role that we give to science, the role that we give to social sciences, the role that we give to neuroscience these days, and the development of the mind and so forth. And I would love to hear you speak a little bit about what it's like for you to be the person that is doing this kind of work, that's drawing people's attention to things that some of us might intuitively say, yeah, this stuff is really important. I would love to hear you talk about how you've observed that the work that you do has perhaps carried a certain capacity for drawing people's attention to these important features of the world that we live in, when perhaps other voices would have a harder time getting people to pay attention to that.
Well, I'm glad you used the term paying attention because if we stress as we do in psychology the scientific basis that it's a psychological science. Now, there's two cultures in psychology. The other is more of a clinical culture that's there. But even most clinicians are also very interested in empirical work, scientific work. And so,
Right.
what's curious, though, is that when you say, well, the psychology of religion and psychology of spirituality, that draws people's attention right there because they see two things that they perceive as really incompatible. Um,
Right.
that psychology as a science, religion is not that way, and how do you try to mesh the two? So one of the things that I try to do, even though I'm committed as a Christian, is that I try to maintain neutrality in most of my work. Now, I'm also a member of the Christian Association for Psychological Studies, where I don't necessarily try to maintain neutrality. But in much of my empirical work and in most of my publications, you wouldn't be able to tell where I'm coming from as an
Hmm.
individual. I kind of appreciated the fact that I could be open right here at the beginning of this interview about that. But what happens is that people will, if I came across like with that I've got a particular position that I'm trying to push as a believer, for instance, I think I would lose much of the audience. But if I stress, no, I'm holding to the best science that we possibly can, and that this is simply what we're studying, it does open the doors. And I'm part of organizations that do this. For instance, one of the divisions of the American Psychological Association the title of it is the Society for the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. And
Hmm.
we are all over the place. There are anywhere
Hmm.
from very committed evangelical Christians over to a hardcore atheist in there.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
yet we are able to work together. Some of my
Hmm.
best friends are over on that atheist side,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
sometimes we've collaborated on research.
Hmm.
And then, of course, there's folks of all different religious traditions that are
Hmm.
that are
Hmm.
interested in this topic as well. So do research in it. So
Yeah.
I think that just stressing our scientific base does command some respect, and I
Mhm.
appreciate that.
So if you were to taking that scientific basis, if you were to imagine what the two or three or one or two, whatever you'd like to pick, one or two or three things that if you were imagining how workplace spirituality was potentially going to affect the health of an organization, for our listeners who are out there who are hearing this and they have the opportunity to hear your voice, an expert who's really looked at the psychology of human experience and how that's playing itself out in the workplace, what would be for those leaders who are responsible for some of these organizations, what would you want them to hear as some of the two or three more important things for them to pay attention to, recognizing that they themselves are going to be working with a diverse array of people in their organization?
Absolutely, and I think that's a key point. What you mentioned there at the very end, how diverse is the group, and how diverse really is the mission of the organization?
Hmm.
Now, folks who have done some work in this area of workplace spirituality have often made a distinction between what they call enabling organizations and directing organizations. And an enabling organization acknowledges spiritual strivings, but allows individuals to discover their own idiosyncratic tendencies. And that's apropos for many organizations. Just to give you a couple examples, the World Bank, they have folks sit in a semicircle for an hour each week and talk about spiritual issues. But it's wide open what that
Hmm.
conversation can be like.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's Monsanto has utilized experts to teach Buddhist meditation practices during its corporate retreats. Boeing has their 500 top managers listen to poetry for 3 days a month as part of their executive training program. I don't think it's all day long, but
Right.
for a fixed period of time in those 3 days. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole idea is you're going to have such diversity in organizations like that. Okay, that you have to be rather open, and there's some advantages to having an enabling type of organization. It usually leads to a lot of worker satisfaction. They're able to personalize their spirituality and their understanding of spiritual fulfillment. Most people in our culture, in our society, would say it leads to spiritual diversity, which is a good thing, um, and so forth. There are some drawbacks to that approach as well. You could have some potential conflict because you're maybe stressing dissimilarities. You might be sort of implicitly sanctioning almost any and all spiritual practices, even some that aren't very healthy, and so
Hmm.
forth. So that's one end of the continuum. But the other end is what we might call directing organizations. And a lot of probably your listeners would maybe fall into this category where they at least maybe they don't work for a directing organization, but they are interested in how such organizations operate. Some examples would be Hobby Lobby or maybe Chick-fil-A, faith-based institutions like where I work,
Hmm.
where it's pretty much the cosmology, the worldview is pretty much defined, and it's intimately tied to to the mission and the practices of the organization itself. And one of the advantages of this, so for instance, at Biola, we sign a statement of faith. Not all Christian
Hmm.
universities do, but some do, and we are asked to. Well, so there's a self-selection process. A lot of people don't want to go to and work at a university like Biola, even if they are believers. They just feel
Hmm.
like that's too restrictive. But what it does do with that self-selection process, it helps to solidify one's sense of identity, the whole sense of what matters and the values that are found, the sense of purpose that's there. It's endemic in the organization itself, and when it goes back to that person to institution fit notion, that there seems to be a good fit when you have a directing organization that clearly spells out what they are about, and then you have people who identify with that. The downside, of course, is a lot of people don't like that, and sometimes you might miss out on some of the most skilled individuals because you're such a directing organization.
I can hear in our conversation the significance of both, on the one hand, how the vitality of a person's spirituality and the psychological formation that has contributed to that or is expressed in that both has the capacity to form the organization. And I'm also hearing that the organization itself, in terms of what has emerged intentionally through the leadership of that organization, also has the potential for creating a space for people's spirituality to flourish. And I'm hearing you, if I'm hearing this right, I'm hearing you describe that there is this perhaps rhythm that is going on between these two things. There's the organization, and there are the each, the contributing individuals states of that. But regardless, it sounds like that a person's psychological and spiritual maturation is a significant part of what takes place in our work, and that our spiritual notions, our notions of spirituality, also go a long way in shaping how we gravitate toward the kinds of work we gravitate toward, and our posture toward that work at the end of the day.
Well put. And I do think that especially from a Christian perspective of posturing ourselves in a way which is really congruent with what our faith tells us we should be doing,
Mm-hmm.
which is things such as practicing certain virtues, compassion and forgiveness and gratitude and humility. And so when we can really embody those things, and that just leads to then much better relationships with other people, and they can start practicing some of those virtues, and it just creates a much more desirable workplace, quite honestly. But
Right.
but it requires a certain amount of effort, and not all of us are particularly good at that.
I understand that. I noticed that you at the one point in your work, you had been engaged in a grant that addressed humility in leadership roles. And you mentioned humility just a moment ago as one of those virtues in workplace, well, anywhere for that matter. But in our final time here, I would just love to hear what you find that you've discovered about humility and leadership and workplace experiences, and how paying attention to that makes a difference for us.
Yeah, a lot of that came after reading Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, about organizations that seem to flourish after the CEO leaves for many years.
Mm. Mm.
And that was a key. And what they discovered was it was the humility of the CEO who had been in that position for quite a while that seemed to carry over into the organization. And a lot of that is intellectual humility. It's not
Mm.
that I've got the answers. Okay. It's much more that I'm here and I'm trying to learn from you. So it's an openness, I think, that's there. And it's also admitting limitations. We often feel like our leaders have to be people who don't have limits. And in reality, what Collins discovered was no, if you admit some of your limitations, you're human then, like everybody else in the organization. And that seems to have a very positive effect upon how efficient the organization runs. So intellectual humility, not having all the answers, not being motivated by status, I think is very, very important in effective workplace functioning. So that's what some of our research has documented. It was a lot of good ideas that Collins laid out, and he kind of established a bunch of hypotheses. And some of our work has been done with CEOs, and we've discovered that, boy, when they practice, especially intellectual humility, it seems to have a lasting effect on the organization.
Dr. Hill, it has been a delight to have the opportunity to meet you and speak with you today. I know that our listeners are curious, thoughtful people of faith, and many of them may be interested in making contact with you, getting more resources. If they wanted to do that, what would be the best way for them to do that, make contact with you, or where would you send them to check out on more of your work?
Well, there is a website at Biola, and if you just simply go to that website, Biola University, and then just you can scroll through names, or just I think you can search my name on that. You'll see some of the work that I've done, but I'm also happy to answer email. Sometimes I'm a little slow; it depends upon how many emails come in a given day. But I do try to respond, and I'm happy to do that. So feel free. It's peter.hill at Biola, and that's spelled B as in boy, IOLA.edu.
Peter, it has been a delight, as I mentioned before. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today, and I look forward to continuing to follow up with you with more of your work.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed this time together.
You have been listening to the NeuroFaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Curt Thompson, and today my guest has been Dr. Peter Hill. I look forward to your joining us for our next episode this season as we continue our journey to explore life at the intersection of neuroscience in the light of following Jesus. Until then,